Let us begin with chapter 6, part 2, chapter 6 of Gulliver's Travels. As I was telling you that this chapter is very close to the satirical point of view, the satire on the politics of England. Okay, it deals with this chapter and even the next chapter deal with the English politics as it is seen through Gulliver's eyes, and it has two layers. Okay, here the king is willing to know what is happening in England, how England is and everything. Gulliver is describing with pride that such and such things happen in England, such things are there. He is quite happy to describe the things to the king. But what we find here is that the king, by the end of all this description, he raised many queries to the lords and the commoners and everything. But what we find here is that the king realizes that the English people are nothing but quarrelsome people. Okay, those people are described as the most pernicious race of little odious vermin, okay, that nature ever suffered to crawl upon the surface of the earth. Okay, and I quoted this. So what we find here is that the more attempt Gulliver is trying to depict England in a better way, the more the futile attempt is being described, the more satirical the text is becoming. Okay, because of the layer. The first layer is Gulliver is describing with pride, but the second layer that is present is of the narrator. Okay, not just narrator, but the writer, better to say. Okay, the second layer is of the writer, Jonathan Swift. He is willing to satirize, right? And he is satirizing through whom? He is satirizing through his mouthpiece, Lemuel Gulliver, right? And that is why this is happening. Clear? So in chapter 6, you can title it as, though there is no title obviously, you can title this as His Majesty's Views on Europe, not just England but Europe. And what we find here is that the king desired that Gulliver should give him an exact amount of the government of England, so that he could use anything that deserved imitation for the good of his own country. Okay, any good leader would do so. যে কোনো ভালো রাজা কি করবে, সে অন্য দেশে যে যে জিনিসগুলো ভালো আছে সেইগুলোকে কপি করবে, সেইগুলোকে ইমিটেট করবে. And this king of Brobdingnag is also willing to get more knowledge about the politics, more knowledge about the culture of England, and that is why he is asking Gulliver. Gulliver spoke on the fertile soil of England, the climate of the country. He gave a lengthy speech as to how the English Parliament was constituted, its House of Lords and House of Commons and everything. The Lords with their accomplishments proved to be the strength and support of the kingdom and all that. Okay, those people were aided by bishop and spiritual fathers of the clergy, and the commoners are patriotic, wise men. Gulliver is just describing like this, and they are wise men and they have great abilities. Okay, Gulliver also gave description of the courts of justice and the treasury, and ended with an account of England's history over the last 100 years. Okay, so the king, while listening to all this, raised many queries about the lords, the clergy and the commoners. And what did he conclude? He concluded they were a quarrelsome people. Okay, on account of the numerous wars they engaged themselves in, And it is true, England had been part of several wars, right? And for any person who is not associated with any of the parties in the war, any of the groups in war, he is an alien. He is outside of all these things. He does not even know where England is. Okay, so a person, as a person, he can be said as neutral. Okay, he is neutral to the point that he does not have any kind of interest in England or England's political sphere. Okay, he does not have any inclination of gaining anything from England. So, in that sense, he is impartial, right? So, what we find here is that his motive, he is an outsider, his viewpoint that England is quarrelsome, or they are involved in numerous wars. This showcases the real history or the real condition of England, or even better to say several other countries of Europe. Okay, the history of the country he left was replete with murders, revolution, avarice, and excessive ambition. And this is the satirizing that is being done by Swift. Okay, Gulliver is placing, through Gulliver, Swift is placing the field for the king to criticize England. Okay, and that is being done quite adeptly. Clear? And we cannot confront him. Why? We cannot confront him because he is telling the truth. After all, this history is the history of killing one another, of bringing in defeat, right? So he concluded against that Gulliver was, as I said before also, Gulliver was the most pernicious race of, or the Gulliver's race was the most pernicious race of little odious vermin that nature ever suffered to crawl upon the surface of the earth. And it is true. Clear? And what we find here is that this description is quite true. So this is the summary, this is the gist of the whole chapter that you can look into. Let's go into the detail. Okay. The king who was observing the all the processions, he would then command Gulliver to bring one of his chairs out of the box and sit down with 3 years distance upon the top of the cabinet. Okay, which actually brought him to the level of his face, and in this manner they had several conversations. One day Gulliver took the freedom to tell the Majesty that the contempt he discovered towards Europe and the rest of the world did not seek answerable to those excellent qualities of the mind that he was master of. Okay, the king heard him with great attention and began to convince a much better opinion of Gulliver than he had before. Okay, Gulliver is saying that the king desired that Gulliver would give him an exact account of the government of England, so that he would be glad to hear that, so that he can imitate some of those things if possible. Clear? So Gulliver began his discourse by informing the king that this England the dominions consisted of 2 islands, okay, which composed 3 mighty kingdoms under one sovereign. Okay, besides there are plantations in America. Also, Gulliver dwelt long upon the fertile soil of England and the temperature and the climate and everything. Then Gulliver spoke at large upon the constitution of the English Parliament. Okay, partly made up of illustrious body called the House of Peers, persons of noblest blood, that is House of Lords actually, okay, and of most ancient and the ample patrimonies and everything. Okay, so he is giving describable things, or he is presenting several things for the king to understand. Okay, he described that extraordinary care was always taken of their education and arts and arms to qualify them for being counselors born to the king and kingdom, and they have to share in the legislature to the member of the highest court of jurisdiction. Okay, from when there could be no appeal, and to be champions always ready for the defense of their prince and country by their valor. Okay, that these were the ornament of the kingdom, and these worthy followers were most renowned ancestors and everything. So what we find here is that he is boasting about England. He is boasting about the best thing that England has. Okay, so what we find here is that this ornament and bulwark suggests that this is the pride, okay, pride of England, whose honor had been the reward of their virtue and everything, from which the other countries or other kingdoms degenerate. Okay, so to this what we find here is that several holy portions are added to that and everything. He is describing all those things to take care of the religion. There are bishops and other people. These were searched and sought out throughout the whole nation by the prince himself, okay, and his wisest counselors, obviously, among such priesthood as were most deserved, distinguished by the sanctity. And what we find here is that he is describing, while describing England, he is looking into several aspects of people who are there in the government, who are part of the government, who actually help in dealing with several factors of the government. Okay, so it was the House of Lords. Then what he did, he begins with describing the Parliament House, other part of the Parliament House, that is the House of Commons, who were principally gentlemen, freely picked and culled out of the people themselves, that is like Lok Sabha in our country. Okay, so what I find here is that he describes that, and these two bodies make up the most august assembly in Europe. Okay, to him in conjunction with the prince, the whole legislature is committed. Clear? So this is the constitution. This is part of the parliament. Next he goes on to descend to the court of justice, where he will describe the judges, their venerable sages of the interpreters of law and everything. They are they determine the disputed rights and properties of men, as well as for the punishment of vice and protection of the innocent, and so on. Okay, so Gulliver also computed that number of England's people, also reckoned how many millions there were might be in each religious act or political party, to say there are several people who actually followed these religions or the religious sects or the political parties, to say. Gulliver also described the sports, the pastimes, or any other particular which he thought might be important for the honor of the country. So he is acting, or he is describing things which would actually bring honor to the country, right? But it depends on the receptor, the listener, how he would interpret a thing. Okay, like here I am describing a thing, but it depends on you who are the listener, how you will interpret a thing, right? So it not just depends on this teaching or speaking, it depends on what the message is being received at the other end. Clear? It remains important always. So when you will grow up, or you will do any kind of teaching practice session, if you do that, you will learn that the teaching is not just teaching. Okay, teaching is a teaching learning process. The whole process is called teaching learning. I can teach, I can go on teaching, I can go on speaking, but if you do not understand a single word, the process of teaching is not complete. Similarly, when one is speaking, it depends on how the other person is learning, okay, or what the other person is gaining from your speeches, or what he is gaining from the things that you are describing. You might be describing in the fullest of heart, with the zeal of describing the best of the lot for your country, but it depends on how the other person is accepting it. Okay, so he finished with all the brief historical accounts of the affairs and events in England for about hundreds of years, as I said. So he is describing this only to bring pride. Okay, we will speak of what? We will speak of the 1857 revolt of 1857. We will speak of Indian National Army. We will speak of Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose. We will speak of non-cooperation movement and several other movements that Indians did for their freedom, right? Because that gives us pride. Similarly, or any war, for example, the Kargil war. Okay, after somewhat 50 years from now, or even today, that has been held as one of the greatest achievement of Indian military, right? And several films are made on that. Why? Because they are glorifying that achievement, right? Similarly, any violence that is glorified is described here. Similarly, in any case, what we find, in any case, this life is being described from the perspective of what? From the perspective of the violation, perspective of the existence of human beings. Clear? I had seen in several cases that people are only focused on what? Focused on the achievements of the people by destroying others. Okay, it is very common in other people also, in other countries also. We speak of our achievement in the context where we have defeated others. Clear? And that is what is being done. What Gulliver also do over here is that it is the same. He speaks about the 100 years of history, because those events, those past events, actually brought him or the country glory, and that is why he is describing that. Clear? When he had put to the end of the long discourses that he was dealing with, His Majesty, that is the king, proposed several doubts and queries and objections upon every article that he spoke. Okay, he asks that what methods were used to cultivate the minds and bodies of the young nobility, and in what kind of business they commonly spent the first and the teachable parts of their lives. What commonly spent in the what course was taken to supply assembly when any noble family became extinct, and several questions like this. Okay. Similarly, he also asks what qualifications were necessary in those who are to be elected to be created as new lords. Okay, whether the humor of the prince, a sum of money to a court lady or a prime minister, or a design to strengthening the party opposite to the public interest. Okay, so what is the reason behind all these things? What is the logic? He is asking all these things. What share of knowledge these lords had in the laws of the country? So these are all logical questions. Okay, these logical questions have been pertinent. These logical questions were very important in the life of England. Okay, what made a person superior and be elected to the House of Lords? Okay, what are the qualities? Those were not defined. Okay, and what we find here is that in House of Lords, those people only go who have been close to the prince, or who have access to the powerhouses. Tarai jai. And king is only questioning that, and by questioning that, what he is doing, he is exposing, he is satirizing, he is exposing what, he is exposing the quality of England. Okay, the condition of England. Okay, so he also asks that whether the share of knowledge whether these lords actually share a knowledge in the laws of their country, how they came by it as to enable to decide the properties of their fellow subjects and everything, whether they were always so free from avarice, partialities, or want, or most importantly, do they take bribes, and every other thing. So what we find here is that whether and what we will see over here is that these questions are very important, but no one asks them. Okay, whether these holy lords were constantly promoted to the rank upon the account of their knowledge in religious matters also. Okay, while they were common priests or slavish prostitutes to chaplains, to some noblemen and everything. Okay, so these are the conditions. These are the conditions that are being presented. Okay, also he, that is a king, desired to know what arts are practiced in electing those who are called the commoners, that is, who belong to the House of Commons. Clear? সেইটা হচ্ছে কি, সেইটাও সে জানতে চাইলো whether a stranger with strong purse might not influence the vulgar votes to choose him before their own landlord. ওকে, মানে যে কি মানি পাওয়ারটা কি ইম্প্যাক্টফুল হয়, মানিটা কি খুবই ইম্প্যাক্টফুল হয় কিনা, and these are the very relevant questions. He also asks that how it came to pass that the people were so violent and bent upon getting into the assembly. Okay, in this position, His Majesty, that is the king, seemed to be doubt it might possibly not always be sincere. He desired to know whether such zealous gentlemen could have any views of refunding themselves for the charges and the trouble they were at. Okay, by sacrificing themselves, the public good, to the designs of the weak and everything. And the king multiplied his questions and sifted Gulliver thoroughly upon every part of this subject. Okay, and he proposed numberless inquiries and objections, which Gulliver thought is not prudent and convenient to repeat. Clear? Gulliver actually wondered to hear all these questions, and what we find here is that these questions are very important for satirizing the culture of England. Okay, and that is why Gulliver's naive, so-called naive attitude is being presented over here, and the tone of the king actually criticizes the system of England, the political system of England that is going through. Okay, the king wondered to hear Gulliver talk of such chargeable and extensive wars that were described in the 100 years that have in the describing the 100 years. Okay, that certainly must be a quarrelsome people, or live among themselves with bad neighbors. Okay, he asks what business English people had out of their own lands unless upon the score of trade or treaty, or to defend their coast with our fleet and everything. Above all, Gulliver says that above all, the king was amazed to hear Gulliver talk of a mercenary standing army in the midst of peace and among a free people. Okay, he said that if we were governed by our own consent in the person of our representatives, he could not imagine of whom we were afraid or against whom we were to fight, or would hear my opinion whether a private man's house might not better be defended by himself, his children and family than by a half a dozen of rascals picked up in the venture in the street or small wages. So he is surprised by the creation of the army or the police, better to say, that why common people would be angry on the government if they have chosen the government on their own. তা যদি নিজেরাই হচ্ছে এই গভর্নমেন্টটাকে চুজ করে থাকে, তারাই যদি এই রিপ্রেজেন্টেটিভস পাঠিয়ে থাকে, তাদের কনসেন্টে হয়ে থাকে, তাহলে কেন তারা একটা পুলিশ দরকার পড়বে তাদেরকে কন্ট্রোল করার জন্যে? সে নিজেই কি হচ্ছে পাওয়ারফুল এনাফ নয় তার নিজের বাড়িকে রক্ষা করার জন্যে? Right. So he was perfectly astonished with the historical account that Gulliver gave, which was of the last century, and he protested that it was only a heap of conspiracies, rebellions, murders, massacres, revolutions, banishment and everything, and the very worst effects, that avarice, faction, hypocrisy, all this had happened. Okay. Also, the king is in another audience was at pains to recapitulate the sum of all Gulliver had spoken, compare the question he had made with the answer that Gulliver had given. What we find here is that the laws were best explained and it was interpreted and was dealt with it very carefully. But Gulliver observes among some of these descriptions, what we find? We find that this characteristics of England is very much rebellious in nature. Okay, it showcases England to be a country which actually puts other down. Okay, and here what we find is satirizing is being done in the last section, the last quote of the king. Okay, in the previous sections what we have seen Gulliver's personal significance is illustrated by his reduction to the status of a plaything, right? In chapter 4 and chapter 5 we have seen that plaything in the court. In this section the same lesson is repeated on a larger scale. Why? When he desires to describe his culture, or when he actually describes the culture and the politics of Europe to the king of Brobdingnag, what we find? His identity of being an English person is nurtured, or is seen to be destroyed, or seen to be of lowest quality. His identity to be seen to be of lowest quality. That is of a plaything. Okay, where one is killing another. Okay, suddenly all of the life and death issues that seemed so important when Gulliver was in Europe are revealed to be the trivial concepts or trivial conflicts of minuscule people. Okay, one is fighting for this, one is fighting for that. All these life and death tendencies or life and death issues which appear to be very important in Europe is of not a single bit of importance over here. Okay, they are not only insignificant, but the king also derides them as, and I quote, odious. Okay, in his eyes, the tiny size of the Europeans is matched with the moral weakness that they have. Okay, and what we find here is that this is very important to see, that Gulliver was trying to project his importance, okay, or the importance of England, or the political condition. He was taking pride in it. But ultimately, we are seeing that the political system is being exposed. সেটা expose হয়ে যাচ্ছে. Gulliver manages to maintain some sense of importance of England in the face of the king's criticism, but his protest seems to be contrasting apparently. Okay, it is groundless that each argument he gives of England's superiority, including his argument that the king is too dull-witted to see the beauty of the English culture, serves only to emphasize the futility of his resistance, because we, the readers, understand how great and important the questions of the king is. And it is not the king who is dull, but the people of England who are being put in this glass cage, of believing that they are doing the best thing. Okay, তারা মনে করছে এটাই হচ্ছে important. So actually what we find that the king is not dull, but it is actually the people who believe in killing others, believe in avarice, believe in rebellions. They are destructive. They are destructive for earth. Clear? Gulliver's personality plays an important role in pushing the satirical points. Why? Because, as I told you before also, his naivety, his gullibility, okay, his gullible nature, and his ingenuous praise of England all accentuate his similarity to the Lilliputians. Okay, so convinced of his own significance, they are convinced, as the Lilliputians were convinced of their own significance in their own land. Okay, the king was ordering that, the Lilliputian king was ordering that, and ordering that this should be done. They were bringing in several laws, right? Similarly, here Gulliver is Lilliput, and like that, they are convinced of their own significance, that England is the best, in which they are only people to believe that. When an impartial person comes to deal with things, we get to see that this is being erased within a minute. Okay, this, like the Lilliputians, the English people are convinced of his own significance. He is unable to realize the pettiness and the imperfection of the society he represents. Okay, Gulliver is unable to do so. Clear? So this is the end of chapter 6.